What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? The question wasn't something Alara ever spoke aloud. It lived in the silence of the old stable, in the way the frost cracked under her boots like tiny bones as she walked down the aisle. It was in the smell of old hay and dust, a scent that had once been her grandfather's cologne. The wind whistled through a broken pane in the loft, a lonely, hollow sound that seemed to suck all the warmth from the world. It was always winter here now, in the fields, in the barn, and most of all inside of her. She came every day at 4 o'clock. A ritual of guilt, of obligation, a penance for a grief she couldn't seem to shape into anything useful. She would push the heavy door open, its groan a familiar protest, and stand for a moment in the vast, dim silence. The other stalls were empty, their gates yawning open onto nothing. The farm had been sold off piece by piece, until all that remained was the skeleton of the main barn and the single, lingering heartbeat at the far end. His name was Atlas, her grandfather's final trail horse, a broad, deep-chested bay with a splash of white on his forehead like a fallen star. He was the last of everything. And Alara didn't know what to do with him. She was a city girl, all sharp angles and nervous energy, her hands better suited for tapping on a keyboard than mucking a stall. Her life was a small, quiet apartment, the hum of a computer, the distant sirens of a city that never truly slept. This place, with its aching quiet and its raw, unforgiving chill, was a different planet. She felt like an imposter in her own inheritance, her grief a coat that didn't fit. She'd slide the bolt on his stall, the sound echoing. He was always there, standing in the same spot, his head slightly lowered. He didn't startle at her entrance. He didn't whinny for his dinner. He just waited. There was a profound stillness to him, a quietude that felt heavier than just an animal being calm. It felt like listening. The first few days she'd just dump the grain, fill the water, and leave, her throat tight with a sorrow she couldn't name. It was easier that way, to not look too closely, to not see the ghost of her grandfather in the curve of the horse's neck, in the way he lipped at his hay. But you can't avoid a ghost when you're living in its house. Today she moved slower. The chores were done. The sun was already bleeding away behind the skeletal trees, casting long blue shadows across the floor. She leaned against the stall gate, the rough, cold wood a grounding pressure against her spine. She just looked at him. He turned his great head toward her. His eyes were dark, liquid pools, but there was a strange quality to them, a lack of focus, a depth that seemed to go beyond mere sight. He breathed out a long, warm cloud of steam in the cold air, a soft sigh that seemed to hold its own kind of weariness. Without really thinking, her voice a ragged whisper in the quiet barn, she spoke to him for the first time. "What am I supposed to do with you?" It wasn't a real question. It was the question that had been haunting her for weeks, given sound. Atlas didn't move, but his ears, which had been relaxed, swiveled forward. They pivoted with a delicate precision, tuning into the frequency of her voice, the exact spot where she stood. It was such an intense, specific gesture. It felt like an answer. Her breath hitched. It was the first thing that felt like a connection, however faint. A thread, thin as spider silk, spun across the space between them. The next day, she didn't leave after filling his bucket. She brought an old stool and a book she had no intention of reading. She sat just outside his stall, the gate between them. She said nothing. She just let her presence become part of the barn's rhythm, another sound in the symphony of creaking wood and shifting hay. He ignored her for a long time. Then slowly he took a single step forward. Then another. His movement was fluid, confident. He stopped a foot from the gate, his nose almost touching the wood. He stretched his neck out, his nostrils flaring as he drew in her scent. He wasn't just smelling the air. He was reading it, learning the map of her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She stayed perfectly still, afraid that any movement would sever this fragile moment. He blew out gently, a warm, grassy breath that misted in the cold. Then he did something that made her own breath stop. He lowered his head, not in sleepiness, but in a slow, deliberate bow. He held it there, his forehead nearly touching the bottom of the gate as if in offering, as if in shared grief. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes. She hadn't cried since the funeral. The tears had been frozen inside her, a solid block of pain. But this quiet, wordless gesture from a 1,000-pound creature thawed something. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no music swelling. Just a girl on a stool and a horse with his head bowed in the gathering dark. She didn't reach out to touch him. The space between them felt too sacred to break. But she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I miss him too." A week passed. The silent sittings became the new ritual. Sometimes she talked, telling him fragments of memories, stories about the grandfather they had both loved. Sometimes she just cried, the tears falling silently into the straw at her feet. He was always there, a silent, steady witness. He began to anticipate her arrival, his ears pricking at the specific sound of her car engine dying in the lane. One afternoon she was late. A meeting had run long, traffic was a nightmare. It was fully dark when she finally pulled up to the barn, her headlights cutting two desperate paths through the blackness. She was flustered, angry at herself, her city life intruding on this sacred space. She rushed through the chores, her movements hurried and clumsy. She didn't sit. She just needed to finish and go, to retreat back to the numbing buzz of her apartment. She slid the bolt closed on his stall with a final sharp clang and turned to leave. She took 3 steps down the aisle, the beam of her flashlight bouncing erratically ahead of her. And then she stopped. Because behind her, she heard the soft, unmistakable sound of a hoof stepping out of the stall bedding onto the concrete aisle. Then another. A slow, steady, clopping rhythm. Her blood went still. She turned slowly, raising her flashlight. Atlas was out of his stall. He had nudged the gate open behind her. He stood there in the vast, dark emptiness of the barn, his head held high, his ears pointed directly at her. He wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He took another step toward her, his movement sure, his path a straight line. He had followed her. In the shaky circle of light, she finally saw it clearly, the thing she had felt but never let herself truly see, the thing that explained the profound stillness, the intense listening, the way he navigated his world not by looking but by knowing. His eyes, those deep liquid pools, didn't catch the light. They didn't reflect it back. They simply absorbed the beam into a bottomless, gentle darkness. The horse was blind, and he had chosen to follow her into the unknown. The truth of it settled over Alara not like a shock, but like a deep and sudden cold. A clarity that froze her in place. The careful way he moved in his stall, never bumping the walls. The way his ears were his compass, his nose his map. The profound trust it must have taken for him to step out into the vast, unfamiliar darkness of the barn aisle, following only the sound of her retreating footsteps. He wasn't just calm. He was navigating a world he could not see, and he had chosen to follow her. She stood there, the flashlight trembling in her hand, the circle of light wavering on his chest. He took another step forward, his hoof meeting the concrete with a soft, sure click. He wasn't afraid. He stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. He lowered his head and sniffed the air around her coat, then nudged her hand with his velvety nose. A question. A confirmation. "I am here, are you?" From that night on, everything changed. The obligation vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective awe. Her trips to the barn were no longer a penance. They were a pilgrimage. She learned to move around him with sound, humming softly so he always knew where she was. She stopped wearing perfumed lotion so her scent was a constant, reliable thing. She watched him, really watched him, and saw not a disability but a different way of being, a deep, quiet intelligence that listened to the world instead of just looking at it. She began to talk to him more, not just snippets of memory but whole stories. She told him about her grandfather teaching her to fish at the creek, his rough hands guiding hers on the rod. She described the way he'd whistle old folk tunes while he mended fences. Atlas would stand, his head drooping low, his bottom lip slack with contentment, his ears flicking back and forth to catch every syllable. Sometimes at the mention of a specific word, creek, apple tree, ridge trail, his head would come up, his ears would pin forward with a sharp intensity, and he'd let out a soft, low whicker. It was a sound full of recognition, a key turning in a lock deep within him. It unnerved her. It was more than a horse reacting to a familiar word. It was a specific, pointed alertness. It felt like memory. One afternoon, desperate to bridge the gap between them, to give him something more than just words, she found an old hackamore in the tack room. It was her grandfather's, the leather worn smooth and dark from years of use. She didn't plan to ride. She just thought he might know it, might find comfort in its familiar smell. She approached him slowly, letting the leather creak in her hand so he could hear it. "Look what I found, boy." The moment the scent of old leather and her grandfather's sweat hit his nostrils, Atlas flinched as if touched by a live wire. He threw his head high, his whole body tensing. He didn't spook or rear. It was a tremor of pure, visceral recollection. Then he let out a sound she had never heard from him. A long, deep, yearning nicker that was less a sound and more a physical ache made audible. It was a call for someone who was never coming back. It shattered her. The careful wall she had built around her own grief, brick by brittle brick, crumbled into dust. She sank to her knees in the straw, the hackamore falling from her hands. The sobs came then, great, heaving waves of them wrenched from a place so deep and dark inside her she thought it would tear her apart. She cried for her grandfather, for his empty chair at the kitchen table, for the silence where his whistle should be. She cried for this magnificent broken animal, who remembered a love she thought was hers alone to mourn. She cried for herself, for the loneliness of a life half-lived, for all the words left unsaid. She was adrift in the storm of it, blind and lost. And through the blur of her tears, she felt him, a warmth, a pressure. Atlas had taken the 2 steps to where she knelt. He lowered his massive head, his breath warm and soft in her hair. He didn't nudge her. He didn't ask for anything. He simply rested the weight of his jaw, his great blind head against her shaking back. He stood like a rock in a river, letting the current of her grief break around him. He held her up. He stayed there, his breathing slow and steady, a metronome in the chaos, until her storm had passed and the sobs subsided into shaky, exhausted breaths. She didn't know how long they stayed like that. But when she finally wiped her face on her sleeve and looked up, she saw the world anew. The barn wasn't a tomb anymore. It was a sanctuary, and the horse standing over her wasn't a ghost. He was a keeper of the same flame. Weeks bled into months. Winter's tight fist loosened, and a tentative spring began to green the edges of the fields. Ilara's life in the city felt like a distant dream. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. Her heart, once locked away, felt open. The air itself felt lighter. One bright, cool morning, with the sun dappling through the new leaves, she felt a pull, an impulse. She led Atlas from his stall, not with a rope, but with her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She walked him out of the barn and down the familiar path toward the back pasture. He walked with a confident, eager gait, his head high, drinking in the scents of the waking earth. She stopped at the old gate that led to the ridge trail, the one her grandfather had ridden every single day. The one she hadn't set foot on since she was a child. At the sound of the creaking gate latch, Atlas's whole demeanor shifted. He grew alert, energized. He pushed past her, not with impatience, but with a sudden, undeniable purpose. It was he who led her now. He knew every step, every dip in the path, every overhanging branch he needed to duck. He moved with an unerring, innate knowledge, his feet finding the sure ground, his body remembering a rhythm laid down over 1,000 rides. He wasn't walking. He was coming home. And Ilara, her hand on his neck, simply followed, her eyes seeing the path for the first time, while he saw it for the 1,001st, with a heart that remembered everything. They walked for an hour until the path opened up onto the high ridge, the one that looked out over the entire valley. He stopped exactly on the spot, as he always had. She stood there beside him, looking at the world spread out before them, and she finally understood. Her grandfather hadn't just left her a horse. He had left her a guide, a creature who knew the way through the darkness by heart. Atlas had not been broken by his blindness. He had been refined by it, forced to see with a deeper sight, to navigate by love and memory and trust, and he had been waiting for her to learn how to do the same. She rested her forehead against his shoulder, breathing in the smell of horse and sunshine and old leather. She had come out here to give an old blind horse a final walk, but he had been the one leading her the whole time, leading her out of the winter of her grief and back into the light. Sometimes the ones who carry you are the ones no one else saw coming. If this story of Atlas and Ilara found a home in your heart, if it reminded you that even in our darkest hours, guidance can come from the most unexpected places, then do not let that feeling end here. The stable is always open and more stories are waiting to be told. Subscribe to this channel and become a part of this community. Let us know in the comments what this journey meant to you. Press the bell icon so you never miss a story, so you can be right here for the next tale that just might change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.